All right, I think we are live. I just, in trying to be smart and closing down all the stuff on my computer, like the extra programs, I closed down all my lecture notes, which I actually wanted to have up, so that I could just refer back to them, make sure I'm not missing anything. So give me a second to open up all my folders and folders within folders, get to my lecture notes. Okay, there's that. So we are talking today. This is a review session for, not for an exam, but just there's been a lot of material, right, in the last couple weeks that you've been largely responsible for doing on your own, and we haven't had a chance to talk about it yet. So I thought it would be useful, maybe, if we just spend an hour or so where I'm going to go over some of the major points of those various lectures. And if you have any questions, if you're like, no, that doesn't make sense, didn't make sense the first time you talked about it and it still doesn't make sense, you can chime in the comments and I'll be able to see exactly where like things need to be refined a little bit, because I don't always know, what sticks and what doesn't. So we're going to talk about linguistic anthropology, and there was part 1 and part 2. And then there's the Foragers lecture, and then sex and gender, and kinship and group structure. So that's what we're going to go over. Obviously, I'm not going to be able to talk about all of the details of every single lecture because I can't cram 4 or 5 lectures into an hour. But I can at least give you like the main points, and that will help identify, hopefully, the things that you need to be thinking about as you're, committing them to your brain and tucking them away so they'll be there when it comes time for the final exam. So let me just bring up my chair a little bit. Okay, felt like I was sitting low like a kindergartner. Okay, so we've got that. We've got linguistics, foragers, sex and gender, and then where's my kinship? There it is. Okay. Get back to this. All right. Ooh. Okay, so I'm hoping, hello, good to see you, Cassandra. Sorry, I've got my tea. I saw this video the other day of like the different types of people on Zoom. And it's like one person who's clearly watching TV in the background, and then there's the drinker, the person who always has their 17 different beverages with them the whole time. And that's definitely me. So, okay, I'll tell you what, before we kick into all of the lecture material, and we got lots of it, there was something, I sent out that like video yesterday, and good Lord, it took me so many times to record that, because as I was going, it was just like all of a sudden I'd forget what I was saying, or I'd say something stupid, or a siren would go by, or my dog would start thumping his tail against my desk. And it just like went on for way too long. But one of the things that I kind of wanted to bring up, but then it just started sounding weird, was it's actually something from psychology. Listen, I'm obviously not a psychologist. I've never even taken a psychology class, but psychology is one of those fields that, definitely more so than anthropology, kind of like bleeds its way into our everyday lives, and we get little bits and pieces of it, and we have like this sort of pop psychology. So one of the little pieces of psychology that kind of came into my brain the other day, I was reminded of this concept. It's called Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And if you've taken psychology, maybe you've talked about this before. I'm going to draw a little diagram just because it helps for visualization. So in this concept, basically the idea is that all humans have these needs in our lifetime, right? And there are 5 basic needs, and we can imagine them as being different levels of a pyramid, like this. So down at the base here, these are the physiological needs. That's things like air, water, food, clothing, shelter. Above that are safety needs. It's like having your health, being able to pay your bills, being able to pay your rent, having a job, having the resources that you need around you. Then above that is like love and compassion, or love and belonging. So being connected to a network, having family, having a sense of belonging within a group. Above that is called esteem. This is like self-respect, respect for other people, knowing your place or feeling good about your place in the world, having freedom, having inner strength. And then up at the very top is I can't spell, actualization. Self-actualization is like the desire and the ability to become who you want to be the best version of yourself, whatever that means to you. Now, the reason why this kind of came up to me the other day, or why I was thinking about it, because I think it's really applicable to what's going on right now, certainly for a lot of you, here in New York, as the coronavirus is continuing to be a really serious threat. What this sort of pyramid of this hierarchy of needs is telling us is that it's really hard to get these higher levels of our needs met if our lower levels are threatened. College, like being in college and taking classes, whether it's face-to-face or online, doesn't matter. That's all part of like the self-actualization stuff, right? Because college is part of the process of, achieving whatever goals you have in life. So college is the stuff up here. But right now, people are worried about these two levels of the hierarchy. These are the immediate concerns for a lot of New Yorkers: our physiological needs and our safety needs, right? If these things are at risk, it makes it harder to deal with this stuff. The reason why this came up for me is thinking about how everyone is, dealing with and managing being a college student while all of this is going on as well. And some days that there are just days when you're like, I can't with this. How in the world do you expect me to worry about this stuff when I'm worried about this stuff? Okay. And if nothing else, I hope that everyone can give themselves a little bit of a break, and a little bit of like, yeah, maybe today I don't need to be worrying about this stuff. Maybe it's okay if I just say, let me focus on, my physiology and my safety. That's going to be the number one concern. It's okay that that's a priority, and it should be. And I certainly don't expect you to be able to power through to this when this stuff is still so pressing. So, sometimes I think it's important for us all to remember to just like cut ourselves a little bit of slack. I am trying to do what I can to also cut you some slack by like giving these flexible deadlines. I'm giving you a lot of extra credit, which I know just feels like extra work, but hopefully you can see it as an opportunity. I hope that all of this stuff with class you can see as opportunities rather than just further stressors. Okay, so I don't know. That's not anthropology, and it's just sort of a side thought. But I wanted to share it with you, and maybe I'll drop a link into the description of this video later with a little bit more information about that. Okay, thank you for indulging me while I went through that. Okay, so let's go ahead and start talking about linguistic anthropology. All right, we'll start with that stuff. I'm just going to have my lecture notes with me so that I can make sure I'm not leaving out any key words. So linguistic anthropology, first of all, is the study of language as it's used in a cultural context. It's how people use language within their societies. And we know that within a group of people who all speak the same language, they're not going to speak language the same way, right? And there are lots of different ways that we see language used differently between people who all speak the same language. This is true in English, in Spanish, in French, in Arabic, in Chinese, in any language that you can think of. People are going to speak it differently, right? So we know that in the United States, we have a different style of speaking English than people in England do, right? We've got like different terminology, different slang, different accents. And then even within the US, we've got all these different variants of English, right? New York English sounds different than Georgian English or Minnesota English or California English. So there are all these different ways that we see language varying according to geography. But we also see language vary according to things like gender. So men and women might use language differently. And that's because we're using language for a reason, right? Like often when we're speaking with someone, we're trying to get something from them, or we're trying to convince them of something. And so we use different sort of linguistic strategies to make that happen. And because men and women are socialized differently in this world, because there are still significant differences in terms of how the genders are sort of supposed to act within our society, we use language for different effects. We can also see differences between age groups. So someone who's young versus someone who's old, there might be language differences. We might also see linguistic differences between people based on their socioeconomic status, or maybe their education level, or what else, religion. Like some people swear and some people don't. And for some people who don't, it might be because of religious reasons. Whatever. There are tons of ways, though, that people can all speak the same language differently. And that's what linguistic anthropology is focused on. How do those linguistic differences match up to other social differences? And how does language influence culture and vice versa? So with that, we can study language. We can study language that people used in the past, but we're also really focused on how people use languages today and how that shapes our society and the world that we share today. And we also look at how language changes over time. And so this kind of ties into your homework 3, which is about language loss, right? Language extinction. We know that not only do languages change over time, but some of them disappear completely. And the factors for those are often related, okay? But before we can get into talking about how language matches up with culture, we have to define what language is. So this is the first major thing. If you're taking notes, this is where you want to make sure that you have you're highlighting or you're writing things down. And I'm, if you're working through the linguistic anthropology lecture notes, this is like the second or third slide. We're talking now about primate communication, okay? There are several examples that I included that I linked on Blackboard and in the YouTube video about how primates communicate. And I want you to take a look at those examples because it provides an interesting counterpoint to how humans communicate. And of course, we spent a long time talking about human evolution, or a lot of online time talking about human evolution. If we want to understand what's unique about humans or what's not unique about humans, we need to compare ourselves to our closest living relatives. So it's reasonable that we would compare human communication to primate communication and see what's similar and what's different. So what you would have seen in those videos was the example of the little vervet monkeys, the little guys from Africa who have the alarm calls. Alarm calls are these vocalizations that the monkeys make when they see a predator. And what the experimenters found when they were observing these little primates, or I shouldn't even say experimenters, what the researchers found when they were looking at these little vervet monkeys was that when a leopard would come along, they would give a certain kind of alarm call. And when a snake would come along, they'd give a different alarm call. And when an eagle came, it would be yet a third alarm call. So each predator had a different noise associated with it. And when the little monkeys would hear that noise, they would all do the same thing. Like if they would all pick up their tails if they heard the snake call, and they're standing up on their toes like, oh, where's the snake? Where's the snake? They had very specific responses to the specific sounds that were related to specific threats. That's kind of like a word, right? And so then the researchers did an experiment where they had a stereo that they played the alarm calls even when there wasn't a predator there, and all the little monkeys responded in the way that they had learned by growing up in their society of, picking up their tails or running into the bushes or whatever it was. So it seemed to show that those specific noises had specific meanings. But these vervet monkeys don't really expand beyond that. So it's kind of words, kind of symbols, but they're super limited. They don't really elaborate beyond those couple of alarm calls. Then there were the videos about sign language use with great apes. So there's Coco the gorilla, who was probably the most famous ape sign language user. And then also the chimpanzees, who were taught how to use sign language by their human caregivers. And then in the chimp example, a mother chimp passed sign language on to her baby. So we're seeing that apes are capable of learning sign language and using them pretty effectively, although they have really limited vocabularies, maybe a vocabulary of a 2 or 3 year old human child, and they don't extend beyond that. But they're able to do that symbolic communication when it's given to them by humans. However, they don't create those symbolic systems on their own in the wild. So now let's bring this back into talking about humans. There are 3 major characteristics of human language, and I'm going to write them down, and we're going to sort of chart them to see how human language compares to primate communication. Okay, so the first characteristic is cultural transmission. Right? Cultural transmission simply means that language is passed from one generation to the next, right? We all speak the language that we speak because we learned it from someone else. Even though our brains are organized in the same ways, like all of our brain architecture is the same, we don't have a, sorry, my partner is being extremely loud in the next room on a Zoom call. Even though our brains all have the same architecture for language, the specific languages that we speak are not encoded into our brains. So there's no such thing as like a Spanish brain or a French brain or an English brain or a Farsi brain. We can learn any language in the world. We just have to get it, and grow up with it. Okay. So cultural transmission means that language is learned by growing up in a society or by getting it from someone else. The next characteristic of language is productivity. Productivity is wonderful. It's one of my favorite things about human language. This is the ability to create new words with new meanings based on the existing system. So all of slang is an example of productivity, right? Think of a slang word, and I gotta be honest, I had to stop trying to keep up with slang a while ago. I aged out of it. I'm too old to learn new slang. I kind of ended around like fleek. So just so you know where the level that I'm comfortable with. But fleek is a great example of productivity because it's this new word with a new meaning. Like it means like on point or something that is right in this precise way. I still don't know if you can use it for everything or if it's only eyebrows, but fleek has a very specific meaning and it's been invented within this language system based on the existing system, right? On fleek, on point. So all of slang is an example of productivity, but in fact, all of our words are the result of productivity, right? They've all been invented along the way. We call this a mug. Why? I don't know. But sometime in the past, someone said, we got to give this thing a name. It's a mug. And people go, oh, okay. It's a new word and it represents this new thing. So productivity is what gives our language its breadth. The final characteristic of human language is displacement. Displacement is the ability to talk about things in another place or another time. And a lot of our communication uses displacement. We talk about what's going on over there or what happened 2 weeks ago. So being able to talk about things outside of the right here and the right now. So humans have all three of these characteristics. But now let's think about primates. Do primates have all of these characteristics of language? Well, cultural transmission. Yeah, primates do have cultural transmission and we can see that in the vervet monkeys. They learn those alarm calls by growing up within their specific group. So it's not programmed into the little monkeys' brains that when they hear the eagle sound, then they have to run away from the eagle or hide in the bushes. They have to learn that symbolic association by growing up in the group. So we do see cultural transmission in primates. Also, the fact that these apes are learning sign language from humans, that's cultural transmission. That a chimpanzee can teach her baby how to use sign language, that's cultural transmission. So we see cultural transmission in the wild and in captivity with primates. Now we come to productivity. Productivity, creating new words with new meanings. Obviously we have it, but in the wild, primates do not have productivity. Those little vervet monkeys never combine the eagle and the leopard calls to create a new word referring to some other predator. So it's never, eagle snake, and that means something new. It's eagle or it's snake or it's leopard, and that's it. Okay. So in the wild, no productivity. However, in captivity, when apes are around humans, raised by humans, and given sign language by humans, those apes can create new words with new meanings. So an example of that would be Coco the gorilla. She adopted a little kitten very famously, and there's a kid's book called Coco's Gorilla. Nope, Coco's Kitten. Coco adopted this little kitten, and then she was allowed to name it. And this little kitten didn't have a tail, and so when he was curled up, she thought he looked like a ball, so she called him All Ball. All Ball is not a name, right? If you think about, I'm going to name this cat, no one's ever named a cat All Ball before. It's not like naming a cat Steve. It's this completely invented name for this new thing, this kitten. That's an example of productivity. But we only see that in captivity when apes have been given sign language from humans. Okay, last up, displacement. We do not see displacement in the wild in primates. When the little vervets are communicating about eagles, they're saying there's an eagle right here, right now. Not, hey, remember that eagle that we saw 3 weeks ago? Or, hey, I think there's going to be a leopard over that hill tomorrow. It's always a very immediate communication. So here's another part I want you to put in your notes, put a star. If I asked you the question, hypothetically, if I were to ask you the question, do primates have language? Okay, how would you answer this? And how would you defend your answer, right? It's more than just a yes or no question. Do primates have language? Well, this is where you would refer back to this list, right? And based on these 3 characteristics of human language, you would say, no, primates don't have language because they don't have productivity, the ability to create new words with new meanings, and they don't have displacement, the ability to communicate about things outside of the here and now. However, they do have one characteristic of human language, which is cultural transmission. So in that answer, you've not only told me, do they have language, but you've supported it by giving me specific information about what primates do and what they don't do. Those are the kind of answers that I love to see on short answer questions on exams, right? Where you've, like, there's no way that I look at the answer and I go, well, I wonder if they really understood this concept entirely, or, oh, I see where they're going. You never want me to have to guess what your answer is on the exam. Give me the information, spell it out real clear like I'm 5 years old, and support it with this evidence, okay? All right, so primates don't have language, but we can see based on what they do have that they have some little like seeds of language. There's something that all primates share because our ancestors had it in the past. There's something there that has allowed some of us to develop our language skills even more and more. And actually just today, just this afternoon, I saw that there's a new paper that's come out about sort of the origins of language, or the origins of that seed, we could say. And I have not read the paper yet. I barely got a chance to glance at the abstract before I started this video. But basically, it's saying that, previously the thought had been because we humans do language in such a bigger and more elaborated way than other primates, that the language part of our brain had developed after we split from chimpanzees. And that split occurred around 7 million years ago, or at least started around 7 million years ago. So it was thought that the language part of our brain started elaborating maybe 5 million years ago. But this new information, based on doing like brain research on primates that are alive today, suggests that the language centers of our brain, or at least some part of the language support centers of our brain, actually started evolving maybe 25 million years ago. So that's 20 million years earlier than had previously been thought. I haven't had a chance to, like I said, I haven't read the paper, so I can't bring anything more to it than that, but it looks like maybe language or the beginning capacities for language rest earlier in our primate ancestry, which is a pretty cool discovery. And so this kind of naturally leads into the question of when did humans get language, right? If we know that it's something, at least the way that we've elaborated it, is pretty unique because we don't see it in other primates. Can we pinpoint a moment in time when our ancestors started using language the way that we use it today? And it's a really difficult question to ask because, our voices don't fossilize, right? It's very likely that language started out as a gestural system, and then later our vocal cords evolved to support actual speech. And you know what? I already realize I'm going into too much detail about this, so I'm just like going through my whole lecture. Stop, Sheila. So the other sort of way that we could look at it, if we can't find fossils that tell us about evolution, is by looking at genes. And there is one gene that has been identified as a potential language gene. It's called the FOXP2 gene. The FOXP2 gene, everyone has it, like all humans have it and lots of animals have it. But there's a specific mutation of the gene that all humans have, or most humans have. And based on some research on a British family where like half of the family could talk correctly, meaning they could verbalize and regulate the sounds of their speech, and then half of the family couldn't, what geneticists found was the half of the family that couldn't regulate their speech, they had a different mutation on that FOXP2 gene. And so it's thought that this specific FOXP2 mutation, and let me write it down just in case anyone is wondering. Sorry. Fox, like the animal, P2, okay? That FOXP2 gene might be that sort of like light switch in the past that turned on for our ancestors. And if it turns off, then that takes away the ability to regulate speech. Chimpanzees do not have the same type of FOXP2 gene that we do. And that's maybe, if this is a language gene, then that's not a surprise because they can't do that regulation of sound. Neanderthals are European cousins, so the ones who were evolving in Europe while we were evolving in Africa, they did have the same type of FOXP2 gene that we have. So maybe Neanderthals were running around Europe, you know, talking to each other in their own little Neanderthal Shakespeare talk. We do know, though, that whenever we got language, you know, some people think that it happened only maybe 50,000 years ago. I think it's probably closer to 2 million years ago when our ancestors at least first started signing to each other. So probably with Homo ergaster or Homo erectus, just because the stone tools are complex enough and their social systems look like they're complex enough that it kind of requires some sort of language use. But it's, again, very hard to pinpoint in the past. But we know that language lets us do a lot of things that we wouldn't be able to do without it. We couldn't live in a city of 9 million people, 8 million people without language, right? Without the ability to communicate and deal with things outside of our immediate lives. We couldn't have school, we couldn't have computers, we couldn't have markers, we couldn't do any of this stuff because it simply is too difficult to transfer information from one person to another unless we can either verbalize it or sign it. Okay, next up is, next up in the Linguistic Anthropology lecture were those three theories of how our language and our brain and our culture interact. And if you've taken the Nicaraguan Sign Language extra credit quiz, you've already had to, like, you've already kind of been tested on this. So I'm gonna do it real quick. Universal grammar, let me just write this down again, just because I know I'm talking kind of fast. Okay. So universal grammar is the idea that all humans have the same brain architecture. We all have the same ability to use language, regardless of whatever language we speak, right? So basically all of our brains are wired the same way. And then we speak whatever language we speak because that's what we learn at home. But all of us have the same brain wiring, and that is evidenced because of the existence of pidgins and creoles. So these are two forms of language, or two forms of communication. A pidgin isn't considered a true language, really, but it is a style of communication. A pidgin is when two or more languages are combined, but it's just sort of bits and pieces. And I'm going to use the example that I used in the lecture video just because it's an easy one for me. If we imagine that there's a bunch of people who all live in the same place and they need to interact and they need to communicate for whatever reasons, because to do business or, you know, people are falling in love or whatever, but everyone speaks one of three languages. So some people speak English, some people speak Spanish, and some people speak French. But no one is bilingual. They still got to communicate. But just by spending time around each other, they're going to pick up on each other's words, right? And I'm sure you all have had that experience of like not knowing a particular language, but you know what a couple words are just from like context clues. Like you hear it enough that you learn what it means. So if we have our groups of English, Spanish, and French speakers, and we want to communicate something like, I'm going to the beach, I would take words from each of those languages that I know that everyone's going to know those words, and I can put them together to communicate in a very simple way what my particular meaning is. So I might say something like, je walk playa, right? I walk beach. It's not a beautiful sentence. It's not really grammatically correct in any of the three languages. But here we have the French je, the English walk, and the Spanish playa. Je walk playa, everyone's going to know what I mean. That's a pidgin. Over time, pidgins will become more elaborated, and especially as kids are picking up the pidgin, children will start to naturally elaborate the pidgin, and they'll start to fill it in with all the forms of speech that they know, from their own linguistic background, right? So if a kid's learning pidgin, but they're a Spanish speaker at home, they already know about all the different like verb tenses and past tense and present tense and adverbs and adjectives, whatever. They know that in their native language. They can then start to apply those grammatical concepts to the pidgin. And over time, the pidgin becomes more fleshed out. It becomes more rule-based, and it ends up developing into this fully fleshed out language. That's when it becomes a Creole. Okay, so a Creole is a combination of languages that over time has turned into its own new fully fleshed out language. And it doesn't change the other two languages, it just becomes something new. So often when we think of Creole, we think of Haitian Creole, which is a combination of French with some Spanish, some Taino in there, and some West African languages. That's this combination of mélange, and it's become this new language unto itself that you can say anything you want to in Haitian Creole because it is a fully formed language. The reason why pidgins and Creole support the concept of universal grammar is because the fact that you can combine two languages together to create a new language means they both have to have the same components. They both have to have the same basic parts. That means that all of our brains are wired for those parts in the same way. If our brains were wired differently, if the architecture of our brains was different depending on, like for certain languages, then we wouldn't be able to mix languages together to create something new. I want to give you one more little thing to think about, and that is Spanglish. Okay, and you're right, that is thanks to Chomsky, whoever just chimed in the comments. Noam Chomsky is the person who gave us the concept of universal grammar. He's still around, he lives here in New York. Okay, so Spanglish, right? Is Spanglish a pidgin or a Creole or something else? What do you think? A lot of people will say it's a Creole, and then people will say, no, it's not a Creole, it's a pidgin. But in fact, it's neither, because most people who use Spanglish are fully bilingual, right? Someone who uses Spanglish speaks Spanish and English and then mixes them together. And maybe someone doesn't speak as much Spanish or as much English, but they still have that root in both languages, and then they're able to mix the two of them. In a pidgin, you have monolingual speakers who are getting bits and pieces of someone else's language and mixing them, rather than mixing parts of their own two native languages. So Spanglish is a completely different thing outside of this, but it's just a cool thing to think about. Okay, after universal grammar is the critical period hypothesis. I'm scrolling down on my notes, make sure I forget something. Okay. The critical Sorry, my handwriting is going to get worse as we go along. The critical period hypothesis says that our brains have a window of time for learning a language, and that's up until the age of 7. Once we hit 7 years old, the window for language learning starts to close. Now, it doesn't snap shut, but it starts to slowly close. And so the older we get, the harder it is to learn a language or a new language. So certainly any of us who have our second language learners, anyone who has tried to learn another language, outside of the language that they grew up with, that the older you get, the harder it is to learn that language. But if you take a 3-year-old kid and you plop them down in a new language, in 2 weeks they're fluent, right? Because their brains are sponges, these freaky little amazing sponges that just soak up all of the information around them. So it's super easy for kids to learn new languages because their brains are still forming, they're still growing, they're still building those electrical connections. But as we get older, our brains they're already built, they're already set. And so it's really hard to build those new connections. This is also really important. Occasionally there are people who have been excluded from language for one reason or another. We typically, it happens today with kids who have been severely neglected. And it unfortunately does happen that there are some kids who are so neglected by their parents that they're actually never exposed to language. If you've taken sociology, you've learned about this woman named Jeannie. Jeannie was essentially locked away in a dark room by her parents. They thought that they were protecting her, but obviously they had a lot of their own issues going on. They locked her away in a room. They never spoke to her. They fed her just in dishes that they put on the ground. By the time that she was finally found by CPS, she was like 13 or 14 years old, I think. And when she was found, she couldn't speak at all because she had never been exposed to language. And so her brain never learned how to do language, and her brain actually never created those sort of language pathways in the brain. And so even after she was, rescued from her home and she was given all of the resources that she needed and she did, occupational therapy, she learned some language, but she never could become really fluent with any language simply because that window had closed. Okay. So the critical period hypothesis, I think both that and universal grammar, I think there's a lot of evidence to support those two ideas. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm spending too much time on language. It's just so fascinating. Okay, and then the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis says that the language you speak can influence the way that you think. An extension of that is also that the words that you use can influence how you see the world. So I want to talk a little bit more about that, because I think we can see that in our own world today, how the words that people use influence how they see the world and how others in turn sort of see the world. So it's kind of like language almost sets up boundaries for what your brain can understand. In some languages, there aren't all of the words for color that we have, like in English, for example. In some languages, there's dark, there's light, and there's red. And so then people accordingly see colors as one of those three. So like this water bottle, I'd call this green or light green. But if my language only has light, dark, and red, I'm going to call this light. And similarly with these scissors, I say these scissors are orange, but if my language only has light, dark, and red, I'm going to say, well, I might say these are light. I might also say they're red, right? But neither one of those would be options that I would pick speaking English. But in that way, language, so if I call this light and I call this light, therefore, these two things are the same color. I would not call these two the same color. I'd say one's green, one's orange. But if my only options are light and dark and red, I'm like, all right, looks like we've got two of the same color things in my hands. So the language you speak influences the way that you think and the way that you perceive the world. We can also see this in terms of so the social world that we have around us, or the political world that we have around us. And I don't want to make everything political, although I'm sure no one has any guess, there's no mystery about how I feel about the world. Before the coronavirus stuff, there was another crisis going on in America, and that was the immigration crisis at the southern border, where thousands of people were being detained indefinitely by immigration in the United States. Now, if we think about the words that were being used by public officials when they were talking about immigration, this is a good example of Sapir-Whorf, I think, because you had some people in office, some people in the highest level of office, were referring to immigration from the South into the United States. They were talking about an infestation of immigrants, right? Swarms of immigrants. I am feeling lucky now that I've sort of forgotten some of the things that were said. But think about what those words mean: infestation, swarm. What else is an infestation? You never talk about an infestation of flowers or an infestation of puppy dogs or an infestation of, really tasty chocolates. Infestations are pests, right? You have infestations of pests, of things that need to be exterminated. And so when you say there's an infestation of undocumented people at the southern border, that means that they are a threat that needs to be exterminated, okay? And people are very good at internalizing those messages. So when people hear infestation, they think extermination. That's how Sapir-Whorf, the language you use, the words that you use, influences how people think about something. Even though, it's just a word, it does carry additional meaning. I just had another, or even how, how the president talks. Like, I think everyone knows how in the last 4 years, there's been a shift in how a lot of people in the United States talk about a lot of things. A lot of people are feeling a lot more loose and free with their language because that's how the president speaks, right? He's able to use his agency and his position of power to influence the wider social structure, because language has meaning and because the language we use influences the way we see and think about the world. And when he normalizes that language, then people go, oh, well, now it's normal for me to use that language. And now it's okay for me to use that language. And now it's okay for me to think of people who are different from me as somehow not as good as me. So Sapir-Whorf is just language affects the way that you think, okay? I see some comments. So do we think in language perception changes according to one's culture? Yeah, I absolutely think perceptions change according to culture. And I think we can find that in a lot of different examples. Also because, certain cultures have different, place different values on different things. And I don't mean values like, love or honor or respect. I just mean some things are more important in some places than others, right? And so that's going to affect how someone perceives that thing because it has a different social weight attached to it. Okay. Moving into the second part of linguistic anthropology, I'm actually going to kind of leave the next part alone largely, but I do want to bring up this concept of diglossia. A diglossia is when within a language there are high and low variants. High variants are just the ones that have a lot of prestige or social value attached to them, and then low variants have less social value attached to them. So high variants are like academic speech, lawyer speech, business speech. It's the kind of speech that we associated with money and with power and with like political status. Low variants are often more casual. It's what we use with our family and our friends in our neighborhoods, and they don't tend to have a lot of like social status attached to them. And when I say social status, it's like, okay, I'm gonna go, I'm gonna interview for a job. Like I'm gonna interview for my dream job, right? In most situations, the high status variant is going to be a more appropriate style of speech for my very important job interview than my low variant speech, simply because we have ideas about one of them being more proper, more businesslike, more educated, and the other one is being, improper in that setting or, sometimes uneducated. But the thing about these high and low variants that exist within a diglossia is that they are all equally good. If the point of language is to communicate, then as long as whoever you're talking to and whoever you're listening to, as long as you can understand each other, as long as you are able to communicate everything that you want to communicate with each other, there's nothing that makes one better or worse. It's simply that society puts these values onto one or the other to say this one is better and this one is worse. And we use a person's use of one variant or another to make judgments about them, okay? So it's a way that culture has invented these rules, and then we use those rules to make judgments about other people. And I'm not trying to say that, here's what I don't want you to think. I am not saying that there is a right way to speak a language and a wrong way to speak a language. There's not a right way to speak English. There's not a wrong way to speak English. Sorry, I keep hitting this thing on my desk. There's not a right or a wrong way, except for the ways that we as a culture have defined. So I will agree that we all kind of know that there's a right way to speak in a job interview. But the rightness of it, the correctness of it, is made up. It's completely made up. And we could stand to remember that. The way that you speak your language doesn't have to have anything to do with your intelligence, your abilities, your education level. It's just an invented system. And also most of us move between these variants of speech really easily. And that's called code switching. Everyone code switches constantly. I speak to my best friend differently than I speak to my boss. I talk to my partner differently than I talk to my grandmother, right? We modify our styles of speech depending on the situation we're in. And that's how all humans function. And Julissa, you're exactly right. Just like race is an invented system where humans try to categorize their world to sort of figure things out. And listen, this is how our brains work. Our brains are big and beautiful, and they love solving problems. They love solving puzzles. They love finding patterns. Unfortunately, sometimes they pattern make a little bit too much. So we do it with things like race, where we go, oh, this person looks like this. Now I know all of these other things about them. And we do it with language. This person sounds like this. Oh, now I know all of these other things about them, right? So, if on our first day of class, we walked in and I said, I'm going to attempt this particular version of English that commonly occurs in women, and white women in particular. It's the sort of like vocal fry, like baby doll, like Paris Hilton-y voice. Okay, so if I come into first day of class, hey guys, it's me, Professor Nightingale, and I'm super happy to be here. This is gonna be so much fun. It's gonna be an awesome semester of anthropology, and I can't wait to do this with you. I probably said those exact same words on our first day of class, but I didn't talk like that, right? And it's not to say that that's a bad style of speech, but my brain goes, that's not how you're supposed to talk when you get up in front of a class, right? And I think it would probably be hard for a lot of you to take me seriously if I did that. So those variants we can deploy at different times depending on what we sort of how we want to make people feel or how we want them to think about us. But it doesn't mean that one is better than another. It's just that we've decided what's appropriate. Okay. All right. Sorry, it takes a little bit too much out of me to marshal that voice. It's also a little bit too easy to do. Okay, now I need tea. All right. So that's okay. I got to end it with language because I've already been talking about half an hour longer than I was supposed to. Are we cool with moving on from language? I'm going to assume that we're cool. If you do have any other language questions, drop them in the comments and I'll come to them. Okay. For those of you, my Tuesday classes, you wrote those blogs, blog 7 about linguistic diversity. And I gave you things to read about Trayvon Martin and AAVE. And I gave the same links to my Wednesday class as well. There are a lot of really great examples of how linguistic diversity comes into play, and really the assumptions that people make about you, depending on how you speak. And in a lot of ways, it can be really harmful. We make a lot of negative associations about other people that are just fundamentally untrue. And I think it's important to talk about these things because sometimes we all just need a little bit of reminding that we can't just take one characteristic about a person and think we know everything else about them. We all need to be reminded that we've invented, like, not only do we think we know all of these different characteristics about someone, but it's all things that we made up in the first place, right? Like, it's all things that we made up. It's like if I go around telling everyone that unicorns exist, and I'm like, guys, unicorns exist. Seriously, no, I have evidence unicorns exist, and people are like, okay, well, right, so unicorns exist. And then someone comes to me and they're like, oh, hey, did you hear about that new unicorn? And then I'm like, wait, you think unicorns are real? It's like, I made up that thing, and now I'm going to make judgments about someone else based on the thing that I made up, okay? It's all an invented system, but humans are really good at inventing these systems. Man, I wish that we had time together to talk about linguistic anthropology because it is so cool. It is so cool. I mean, not as cool as archaeology, but still very, very cool. Okay, let's talk about foragers. I can do this one real quick. So this is moving on to the next subject matter, right? Hard turn out of linguistic anthropology into... It would help if I could spell this correctly. All right, foragers. The term foragers is used in reference to a type of lifestyle that some humans in the world have. Foraging is a subsistence style or subsistence type. Subsistence just means, how do people make a living? How do people get their food? How do they meet their needs on a daily basis? Okay, so we all would consider ourselves to be like industrialists or post-industrialists, meaning that we go to work, we get money, and then we use that money to pay people for the other things that we need, right? I didn't build my house, but I make money to pay rent to my landlord so that I can stay in his house. I didn't grow my food. I make money so that I can go to the grocery store and buy food that someone else grew for me. And yes, the other term for foragers is hunter-gatherers. So write that down as well. Hunter-gatherers. And you will hear me use those two terms interchangeably, okay? Hunter-gatherers is telling you exactly what these people are doing. They are hunting and they are gathering. And specifically, they are hunting wild animals and gathering wild plants. Okay, so foragers do not, they don't have farms. They're not growing crops. And they're also typically not herding animals. All of the food they get is from the wild. All of the resources that they get are from the wild. So foragers are people who live off of the land. Back in our evolutionary history, all humans were foragers. All humans were foragers up until about 15,000 years ago or so, maybe 10,000 years ago. So we were all foragers until groups of humans started farming here and there around the world. The foraging lifestyle, because you're getting all of your resources from the wild, it basically means that foragers have to be nomadic, okay? Nomadic means that people are moving around their environment on a regular basis. So throughout the course of the year, they're going to be moving to lots of different campsites because it's impossible to get all of the food that you need in one place all year long, right? So you go to where the food is going to be next. Because foragers are nomadic, it also means that they're not living in settled homes all year long, right? So they're not living in one house and then moving to the next house and then moving to the next house. They tend to have much more ephemeral type structures, if at all, for living in, but they don't live in, brick and mortar houses the way that we do in New York or in Iowa or in France or wherever. Okay, so it's a very different lifestyle. Because they are nomadic and because they don't have homes everywhere they go, they essentially have to carry everything that they have with them on their person. So all of their personal possessions have to be transportable. And that means that for the majority of foragers, they have very few personal possessions. The cool thing that comes out of this is that when you have very few personal possessions, it's difficult for anyone in the group to get a whole lot of them. So you don't have individuals who suddenly amass more stuff than everyone else. Another word for stuff could be wealth, okay? If everything that you own, you have to be able to carry with you, that means you're not going to own a lot of stuff. How do we figure out who in our society is better off than anyone else? Well, it's based on how much stuff you have, right? The only point in having a lot of money is so you can have a lot of stuff. And I'm not saying this is right. I'm just saying this is how humans typically are, right? We use our money to buy stuff. And then we use our stuff and we go, who has more stuff than me? Who has less stuff than me? Well, the person who has more stuff, he's up here and I'm down here because I don't have so much stuff, right? We have these social or socioeconomic classes. And we see that people who are in those higher socioeconomic classes also often rise to positions of power. The more stuff you have, the more powerful you are. Not so amongst our nomadic forager friends. The inability to acquire a lot of stuff means that there's less of this sort of stratification of society. Stratification just means that that there are like layers in society: high class, middle class, low class. Foragers tend to not have that type of stratification. They are what we call egalitarian. Okay, egalitarian means that within the group, people have relatively equal status. Now, usually men have a little bit more status than women in these groups, and maybe elderly people have a little bit more status just because of their experience, but it's not like you have one guy's a king, everyone else is peasants, okay? Everyone's more or less equal. Foragers live in groups of about 100 to 150 people max, and we call those groups bands, okay? So they live in bands of 100 to 150 people. And you can also imagine if you're in a group of 150 people, you're going to know all of those people. And it's like that's a relatively small group to be spending all your time with. You don't need a president, right? You don't need a king. You don't need a comptroller if you're in a group of 150 people, because it's all people that you've known your whole life. You're related to them, or some of them are married into your family. So these are like kind of family groups. And these bands will migrate nomadically around together. And the last thing I'm going to say about foragers is they have this particular nomadic style called fission fusion, many of them. And I think I have space just enough to write this one last key term. Okay, fission fusion, right? This means that for part of the year, the whole band is together, okay? And they're all gathering food together. And then at some point in the year, they break apart and they go off into like smaller family groups. And just those family groups forage amongst themselves. The breaking apart is called the fission part. And the reason why they break apart is because in that area at that time of year, there's not enough food for the whole group. So they have to, kind of go off on their own to make sure that everyone gets enough food. Then later in the year, they come back together. That's called fusion, okay? So travel together, fission, break apart, travel to apart, come back together, fusion, right? And all of this is related to how people are getting food that's naturally available in their environment. Today, there aren't many hunter-gatherer groups left. In the lecture video, it talks about several groups that have existed, or that they still exist, but their lifestyle has changed a lot. There's really only one group of forager gatherers. You can tell that I haven't been actually lecturing for a long time. There's only one group of hunter-gatherers who still live like a real traditional, like really in line with how it's been for a long time, who are still living this lifestyle full time. And those are, why am I now suddenly blanking on their name? Oh my goodness. I guess I could look at my notes because I am just having a complete brain fart. Hadza. Thank you, the Hadza. Yeah, kind of similar to a herd. I think it's Kiari. where you have like a group of people, except the difference between like a herd and hunter-gatherers would be that like hunter-gatherers don't just sort of blindly follow each other, which herds of animals are like, oh, that cow Steve is going that way, then I guess I'll go that way too. Hunter-gatherers are like, okay, cool, we gotta break up, break into these different sections. We'll see you in a couple months, berry season, over in that place that we always go. But yeah, you have this big band who's moving collectively, and they also help ensure that everyone is getting the food that they need, right? A lot of the efforts of hunter-gatherers are making sure that their band members are fed. So there's information in the lecture video about foragers on a number of different forager groups. The San, or Juhuansi, they're kind of the most famous hunter-gatherer group. They live in southern Africa. And you've got the Hadza, who I was just blanking on, from Tanzania. They're the ones that are still full-time hunter-gatherers today. You've got the Aceh of South America, like in the rainforest. You've got Australian Aborigines. Those Aboriginal groups have been hunter-gatherers, some of the longest persisting, like large groups of hunter-gatherers that only transitioned in some ways once like colonists and settlers started coming in from Europe about 200 years ago. And then also the Ainu of Japan. So there's this Japanese hunter-gatherer group called Ainu. They live in the northern islands. And they're very much, they're an interesting case because they're similar in a way to Native Americans in North America in terms of how they've been treated by sort of the dominant settler culture. So anyway, check out the video for more details on that stuff. But I want you to keep foragers in the back of your mind, because from this point out, we're going to be coming back to concepts about foragers. Okay. All right. So it's 8 o'clock. And of course, I've mismanaged my time. And I spent way too long talking about linguistic anthropology. I'm inclined to keep going for maybe another 20 minutes or half an hour or so, at least to hit some points. And I don't know, you guys let me know if this is useful or if this is something that could be beneficial. We could do, we could have sort of a standing date for this for the next couple of weeks or something, where I just ramble and hopefully something sticks. So let's talk about sex and gender, shall we? Okay, the terms sex and gender are often, sorry, I gotta readjust myself. The terms sex and gender are often used interchangeably, especially in English and American English, but we're going to use them in two separate ways. Sex refers to a person's biology. Gender refers to a person's identity. Okay, so our biological sex, meaning whether we're male or female or something else, that's based on our genitals, like our reproductive organs, our hormones, and our chromosomes. All three of those they all contribute to our biological sex. We also tend to think, and when I say we, I mean just we as humans, we tend to think about biological sex as being a binary, as like you're this or you're this, you're male or you're female, you're a girl or you're a boy, and that's it. But in reality, biological sex is much more of a spectrum, okay? Yeah, there are people for whom their genitals, their internal reproductive organs, their chromosomes, and their hormones, they all line up to say, okay, this person is biologically 100% male, or on this side, this person is biologically 100% female. But it doesn't take a lot to kind of shift the position on that spectrum. Okay, so between reproductive organs, chromosomes, and hormones, you have any sort of tinkering in any one of those three. And now suddenly we're not talking about 100% this or 100% that, we're talking about something else. And so the word that we would use for someone who has some sort of deviance from those two very hardline ends of the spectrum on biological sex would be intersex, okay? The term intersex replaces the very outdated and the loaded term hermaphrodite. That's because hermaphrodites don't exist in humans. A true hermaphrodite would be someone who has the full set of biological, like the full set of female reproductive organs and the full set of male reproductive organs. And that doesn't happen in humans. It happens in like earthworms and frogs, but not in humans. So you'll never find a human that has all of the female reproductive business and all of the male reproductive business. People who are intersex just have some aspect of their biology, again, whether it's genitals, hormones, or chromosomes, that are somehow atypical from 100% male, 100% female. And being intersex is actually pretty common. So a lot of people are intersex. A lot of people don't even realize it until later in life. And there are lots of different ways to be intersex. On Blackboard, I've included some resources about intersexism, like what it means to be intersex, including some interviews with people who are intersex and who are intersex activists. It's, I think, important to know what intersex means and to know that there are lots of intersex people around us all the time. And there always have been. This isn't new. Intersex is not new. It's just for a long time, people didn't talk about it. And because people didn't talk about it, because it was a thing that was kind of hid away and not discussed, it means, unfortunately, a lot of intersex people have been, really marginalized, and in a lot of cases, really underserved, especially in the medical side of things. There have been tons of babies that have been born over the years that, because their bodies didn't look in some way that someone else thought it was supposed to look, kids have been, forced without their consent as babies into like really unnecessary surgeries that impact their future life, because it impacts like their hormone levels, it impacts how their bodies develop. And it's all an attempt to like fix these kids when there's nothing actually wrong with them in the first place. So anyway, you can read up on some of the intersex resources that I put on Blackboard. The reason why I think it's important to recognize the fact that humans exist in more than just these two flavors of humans, more than just male and female, is because we have, especially in the United States, such a strong idea that if you are biologically male, then you are a man. And if you are biologically female, then you are a woman, right? If there's two sexes, then there's two genders. Gender is the identity side of things. If sex is biology, gender is identity. And so you're either one or the other. But if we look, certainly if we look in the United States today, we can see that gender identity has become more open in terms of how people self-identify. But if we look around the world, and if we look into the past, we can see that gender identity has also been more open in other parts of the human experience. Okay, so I've also put videos up on Blackboard that I will let you explore about the third sex in India. So India has a third sex called Hijras. These are people who often would be considered trans women in the United States, meaning born biologically male, but living in this kind of more more feminine appearance, but they're not considered women. They are a third sex, and they have a very specific place in Indian society. I also included videos of a culture in Indonesia called the Bugis, who have 5 genders, okay? And what's cool about the Bugis is that with those 5 genders, it's not just like, you could be this, or you could be this, or feel what you like, or whatever. All 5 genders are necessary. There's value to having all 5 genders. And there's this quote in the video that's linked towards like this religious figure, this sort of priest within their religion, says, if we didn't have all 5 genders, then our society would fall into chaos. What this is telling us is that gender is something that's created by societies. We create gender and we reify, meaning that we maintain the importance of genders through the rules that we've set up within our society. So again, I'm not saying that gender, sometimes people get really kind of like bent out of shape about this, and they're like, oh, so you're saying just like anything could be a gender, like my gender could be a cup, and my gender could be, whatever. No, gender is influenced by our biological sex, but our biological sex doesn't necessarily hem in gender, right? Biological sex is the base, and then gender grows out of it. And the way that it grows varies from culture to culture, and also from time to time. So gender gender is socially constructed, meaning that we create it in society, and it is often based on our biology, but it's not limited by our biology. Okay. Sorry, let me just check on this question. Can we say that identity is the need to belong to a particular group? Well, in this sense, if I'm talking about gender being an aspect of identity, I simply mean how a person identifies within their society, or how society has told that person to identify, right? So we've also heard this term, you know, it's become more popular in the last couple of years, the idea of someone being cisgendered. And cisgendered, like I could say I'm a cis woman, being cisgendered means that your gender identity matches up to your biological sex. So in that sense, it's like, all right, I was born biologically female. I feel like a woman, and society perceives me as a woman. So in that sense, my gender identity matches up with what my society sees for me. So in that sense, yeah, identity does go into belonging to a particular group. We might also, and this is a bit more than we would typically sort of take this, at least for trying to do an abbreviated lecture, because gender is socially constructed, it also means that just like anything else in culture, culture sets up rules for us. And so that means that sometimes as humans, we are forced to live within the constraints of culture, even when it doesn't necessarily match up to the way that we perceive the world or the way that we would prefer to live, right? So I don't, it's like you can, and you see this in literature from the past as well, where it's like there are some, especially women, there are some female characters in literature that you can make a strong case that those characters were, you know, if they were living in the 21st century, they would have been gay, or they would have been queer, or they would have been this or the other. But because they had to live within the constraints of their time, you see expressions of that aspect of their personality manifesting in much different ways, right? So we're all individual humans. We all have our own agency, but our agency is still constrained in large part by the rules of the culture that we grow up within, or the rules of the culture that we live within. It's a really robust and fascinating field for discussion, and one that I wish that I had a greater sort of depth, like in terms of the theory and the history of the theory. I wish I had a greater depth of knowledge to pull from. But we can see, whether we look at ourselves, whether we look at our families, gender is this created way that we classify ourselves and that we classify others. And that also changes through time, right? The idea that a person can be trans, a trans man or a trans woman in the world today, many of us anyway, I'll say many of us go, okay, I understand that that's that person's identity. And like, it doesn't blow my mind. It doesn't change my world. It's like, cool. That's just, it's like, oh, you have blue eyes too? Cool. I feel the same way about you with that new piece of information. 100 years ago, it would have been mind blowing to hear that description, right? To hear that gender identity. However, even though that identity hadn't been formally defined 100 years ago, you know what there were 100 years ago? Women who lived as men. They weren't like trans necessarily. They were just women who were like, nah, I'd rather be a dude, and this is my wife. Like there was a man in like Boston who lived he was a man to everyone around him. It wasn't until he died, he went to the medical examiner for an autopsy, that they were like, old George over here, did y'all know he was a chick? Right? So it's like those same, the same sort of elements of identity and agency have always existed, but how they fit within the social constructs, that's what changes as well throughout time. I did a bad job explaining that. Maybe I already included that on Blackboard. It's like the female husbands of like the 1800s. It's cool. Humans, we're so much more interesting than we like to think about ourselves. And in some ways, we're so terribly boring. But we've always been interesting. And gender identity is not it's not something that is only interesting or changing right now. Gender identity, like every other part of culture, is dynamic, and it's constantly been shifting over time. Okay. So what else we got to talk about? Sex and gender. So we know that humans are a little bit sexually dimorphic, right? We know that within a group of people, men are a little bit bigger, a little bit stronger, a little bit heavier, a little bit taller. Women, we live longer. We have, on average, we carry a little bit more body fat on us. We also tend to be a little bit more pain tolerant. I know probably it doesn't seem like that to a lot of guys who are watching this, but women seem to have, at least in some ways, a higher pain threshold than men. That's probably related to childbirth. So we see some definite physical differences between men and women. Like, we can admit that straight out of the gate, that our biology does have an influence on certain aspects of our life. But the major difference between men and women, at least to my mind, is just our role in reproduction. Okay, so if we think about what it takes for a man and a woman to get a child into the world, and to the point where it's like eating solid foods, the time commitment for a woman to produce a child and get it into the world, first of all, she has to have enough like body fat overall and like general health in order to menstruate, right? And if a woman is too thin, if she's not well nourished enough, then menstruation just shuts down. The body's like, you can't get pregnant. So she has to be healthy enough to get pregnant in the first place. And then what's the next step in reproduction? You have to get pregnant, so you have to have sex. Then a woman has to carry the fetus for 40 weeks, then give birth, which can take a couple hours or a day, or for some women, even a little bit more. And then realistically, a woman has to breastfeed the child for about a year. So in order for a woman to put a kid into the world, we're looking at about a 2-year commitment of time. That's a lot of time to put a living thing into the world, 2 years. Compare it to the male investment, the male energetic and time investment. What does a man need to do to get a child into the world? He has to have sex, right? And it could just be one time. So you're talking about a difference in investment of time and energy of one night versus 2 years. That's going to be the major difference between the sexes that influences all of this other stuff in our culture. Okay. And I think that personally, I think that is where we see this true division of humans, and so many other parts of our culture sort of come because of those basic biological reproductive differences. So here's a good key term for us. We'll start out with gender roles. A gender role is just the jobs or the tasks that are assigned to each gender within a community. So for our hunter-gatherers, right? Let's write this out again. Hunter-gatherers. Now the hunting of wild animals, that's done by the men. The gathering of wild plants, that's done by the women. And if we think again about that investment of reproductive time and energy, it makes sense why men do the hunting and women do the gathering. It's not because men are stronger. Yes, they are stronger, but typically you don't hunt with your bare hands. Humans use tools. We use bows and arrows. We use spears. We use guns. We use traps. We use other things so that I don't have to actually walk up to a woolly mammoth and tear it apart with my hands, right? Men don't have that kind of strength. No matter how strong they are, they're not going to rip apart an antelope, and that's what makes them better hunters than women. Men are often, we can say that men are the hunters in hunter-gatherer societies because hunting is risky. It carries a lot of, there's just a lot of risk to it, right? You have to track down these animals. It can last a couple of days to go out on these hunting expeditions. People can get seriously hurt in a hunting expedition. You wouldn't want women to be engaged in that type of endeavor, typically, right? Because if you have a woman who already has some kids or who is pregnant, like, you don't want to have a woman who's 8 months pregnant running after that woolly mammoth with a spear, like, all right, guys, we'll get there. Women are 8 months pregnant, fantastic runners all the time. I'm not trying to say that women can't do it, but it's a very high risk, because if something happens to that woman, if she's injured, if she's killed, that means that she's lost, her unborn child is lost, and probably any children that she has at home are going to suffer significantly as well. So one person being injured has a really big ripple effect. And it's not to say that a man being injured or a man being killed while hunting isn't a big deal. It is. It is a big deal. He's the hunter. But it's not going to have that immediate ripple effect where the rest of the family all gets wiped out. Okay? So what we tend to see when it comes to gender roles is that men do riskier work and women tend to do work that's more, it's considered safer. It's more located around the home. So we say that men do extra domestic work, meaning away from the home. Women do domestic work, which is centered around the home. The other thing that we tend to see is that the extra domestic work, it's riskier work, but it's also work that happens on a less frequent basis. So in lecture notes, there are lists of gender divisions of labor. So it has a list of all the things that men do in like traditional societies, whether it's hunter-gatherer societies or farming societies. And then you have lists of the things that women do. And the women's side of the list is much shorter. The male side of the list is super long. And if you just look at it in terms of its length, it's like, wow, men are doing all of this stuff in these societies and women are just like, they're barely doing anything. They're not even doing half as much work. But what we tend to see is that men do work that happens occasionally. Maybe it only happens once every week or once every month or once every year. Whereas the work that women do is work that happens every day. It's the stuff that you have to do every day to keep everyone alive. So women are often doing the majority of the subsistence work. When men go out hunting, they might bring back an animal only every couple of days. But you can't wait to feed everyone, just when he comes back with an animal. So women, the gatherers who are collecting wild plants and often wild, like smaller wild animals, they're responsible for making sure that everyone eats on a day-to-day basis. Okay, so men are doing high-risk, extra domestic, more occasional work. Women are doing domestic, subsistence, everyday work. Again, the idea is stay closer to home, do safer activities. There's less risk for the mother, for the child, and then the other children that she has that would do those more domestic tasks with her as well. Next, we have gender stereotypes. Gender stereotypes are the oversimplified but commonly held ideas that we have about the genders in our society. Gender stereotypes are based on gender roles. So if women predominantly do domestic work, like if we say that the gender role is women take care of the home, right? And even in New York in 2020, for a lot of us, women are still primarily in charge of making sure that our house is clean, that there's food, there's laundry, like we do the subsistence work. It's also, you can bring in the mental work. And now I'm not remembering the specific term for that, but it's like remembering, you've probably seen that comic online where it's like women are carrying the mental load, where it's like, I'm remembering not only that we need to get peanut butter and that the dog has a vet appointment next week, but we have to remember to send your mother a birthday card and don't forget to pick up the bottle of wine for your boss's party that we have to go to. Like women do more of the organizing of the family and the household. And that still exists even in, what we would consider a very modern society where women are just as often breadwinners in their families. But so the gender role might be women take care of the household. The gender stereotype builds off of that, and it moves from women have the job of taking care of the household to women are better at taking care of the household, right? The stereotype is that women have some natural ability to be housewives or caretakers, and men don't have that same ability. And a lot of gender stereotypes are they're really stupid, right? And we can see evidence for why they're not true, but they also should cause us to say, like, well, what are we saying about the other gender in response to that? So a lot of people will say that, like, women should stay home to raise their kids because women are natural caregivers. I'm not trying to say that there's not something special that happens between a mother and a child that develops through pregnancy and through childbirth and through breastfeeding. I can only imagine the intense emotional bond that happens from that. But if you say that women are natural caregivers, that means that men aren't? Men can't be? Does that mean men can't love their kids? That means men can't take care of their kids? If I were a man, especially if I were a father, I would be absolutely offended by that idea. Absolutely. I know tons of dads who are amazing caregivers, right? They emote all over their kids, and there's nothing that they wouldn't do for their kids. There's like they'll go to the ends of the earth and they'll do whatever they need. It should offend men, the idea that women are natural caregivers, because it's saying that women have something biologically about us that makes us love our kids more or love people more than men. Now, women often do more of this domestic work, even in the world today. And sometimes, we hear that women are better at doing this work. Is it because we're biologically better? Do we have some part of the brain that's like, this part's devoted to sweeping the floor, this part's devoted to folding laundry, this part's devoted to remembering to buy the birthday card for your mom? No, our brains aren't any different in that sense than male brains, but women have been often socialized from the time that we were babies to be caregivers, right? So if you think about the toys that we give to little girls or to little boys, we're kind of like pre-programming them for these gender roles that we expect them to fill later on in life. Toys for little girls are often dolls, kitchen sets, like little vacuums, little shopping carts, right? It's like mom in training toys. And you don't tend to see that with little boys. Little boys get toys that are about discovery and exploration, and building things, right? There's a real gendering of toys that sets us up. So it's like, no wonder I'm better at sweeping the floor than my partner, because I've been doing it since I was 2 years old, right? In a way that he hasn't. And so from all of that comes the stereotype that women are better at this kind of work and that we have some biological, prevalence towards doing that type of work. That's a stereotype. The idea that we do something because it's like programmed into us, like women are bad drivers. If we're bad drivers, how come our insurance is lower, right? Okay. The last term that I want to talk about for sex and gender is gender stratification. I mentioned earlier, the term stratification refers to when there's like levels of society. So I am having such trouble writing and spelling today. That says gender stratification. It kind of looks like some Viking language though on the right there. Gender stratification means that within a society, one gender has a disproportionate amount of power or wealth or status. And what we see in the world today is that when there is gender stratification, it's men who have more power or more wealth or more status, and women have less. In the United States, we do have gender stratification. It's not as extreme as some other places, right? But gender stratification is the opposite of egalitarianism. Okay. Egalitarianism, you'll remember, means people have equal status. Gender stratification means different status depending on your gender. So the way that we see this in the United States is that men often have higher wages for the same job as women do. or men can reach higher levels within their career field than women do. A lot of this has to do with children. In academia and in business, what we tend to see is that men make more money starting out than women do. A lot of this is because men aren't afraid to ask for raises. Men aren't afraid to ask for what they want and say, this is what I'm worth. Whereas women, we tend to say, well, they'll pay me what they think I deserve. We don't necessarily advocate for ourselves. We also see that in business or in law or in academia, when men's wives have kids, their pay tends to go up and their status within that community tends to go up. But when women have kids, their pay goes down, their status goes down, and their opportunities for advancement go down. So that's the mommy tax, right? That's gender stratification, because it happens. I'm not saying it happens to everyone. I'm not saying if you have a kid, you're automatically like, going to get a bonus or going to get fired, but it happens often enough that it's like statistically meaningful. Okay. All right. You know what? I tell you what, my friends, I hope you are okay with this. Could we leave kinship and group structure? Because that's like a whole other thing. I can do whatever I want, right? I mean, in terms of like scheduling another one of these. I'm going to do another one of these lectures or another one of these reviews next Friday. And if people want to show up to it, they can. If they don't want to, that's cool. But I feel like I'm talked out. We've already gone over a lot of information. So let's leave kinship and group structure. And then just next week, we'll do kinship and group structure and cultivation. That's perfect. That's a perfect solution. Okay, so we're going to stop with that. I'll wait a minute, though, in case anyone has a question, because I've just been like tra-la-lying in my own brain. So yeah, I'm going to run this next week at the same time. This video is going to stay up for eternity, I think. So if you want to come back to this, or, if anyone else wants to watch it, they can. And then next Friday, we'll do kinship and group structure and cultivation. Give folks time to look over that material. So if there's any questions, they can come in prepared. And yeah, I'm trying to think what else. So if you're in my Tuesday classes, you know that this weekend is blog 8 on gender stereotypes. If you aren't able to do it this weekend, that's okay. We've got flexible deadlines, up until the end of the semester. So just get it in when you can. But if you are able to do it, it probably shouldn't take too long, because it's like, it's a kind of, I think it's kind of an easy one. Like, pick a gender stereotype and talk about it. So, women are bad drivers. Women are super emotional, right? So we can't hold public office. Like, a woman can't be president because she might bomb another country because she's on her period. Is that how that works? Because every war we've ever been in has been started by men. So I don't know. It seems like there's some pretty emotional people in government today, and they're not necessarily women. What else? Men are, I've been talking about women, but like gender stereotypes are about men, that men are stoic or men are not emotional. Honestly, I think most of the stereotypes about women are just as damaging to men. They're just as hurtful and harmful to men. The saying of like women are too emotional, the flip side of that is that men aren't emotional. And so if men aren't emotional, and then there's an individual man who's emotional, is he no longer a man? It's damage. It cuts both ways, right? It's like not very useful on either side of things. And there's all these horrible ideas like man up, that phrase man up. Hate. To me, all I hear is like, shove it down. Whatever feeling you're feeling, shove it down. Shove it down, shove it down, shove it down. And men spend so much time shoving that stuff down because they're not supposed to be emotional. It's no wonder you guys don't live as long as women, right? Just from the shoving down of that stuff and having to be stoic and having to be strong. It's all gender stereotypes, which are made up, right? It's all made up. It's a conspiracy. Okay. I haven't seen any other questions come in. So, all right. I'm going to go ahead and end this. It's 8:30. I don't know what that means. Nothing, time is meaningless anymore. But yeah, I'm going to be back here next Friday night, 7 o'clock. Take a look at the material for next week is Cultivation. So if you can do that before next Friday. If you've made it this long with me, thank you. You know, I hope this is useful. I hope it's a distraction, and you'll be getting emails from me over the next couple of days. And also, just if anyone's made it this long, I try to send out emails fairly frequently. I send them out to the class, and I also send them out to individuals. I hope no one takes any of my emails as like me trying to say like, hey you, you're not doing the thing that you're supposed to do, and you got to pay all of your attention to me. 90% of the time, the emails that I send are like, hey, how can I make sure that the things are going the way that we want them to go, right? It's just me checking in. I don't want anyone to think that I've forgotten about them. I don't want anyone to think that I don't care, because I absolutely do care. I care deeply about your success in this class. And it's the only thing that I really have any sort of influence over at this point. So if you get an email from me, don't be scared. It's just me saying like, hi, anthropology. And yeah, I think that's it. I hope everyone has a good weekend. Thank you for being here. Those of you who are here for the live stream, anyone who's watching this after the fact, thank you for checking in. Let me know if you have any other questions. At any point, if you have questions about the material, shoot them to me by email. And I still am doing my online office hours. Okay, so Tuesdays on Collaborate Ultra on Blackboard, Tuesdays 1 to 2 and 5 to 6, and Wednesdays 2 to 3. Okay, have a wonderful evening, everyone, and I'll see you in the next week. Okay, good night.